Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Deconstruction in discourse analysis. Deconstruction is a philosophical and critical approach developed by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. In discourse analysis, deconstruction is used as a method to uncover the assumptions, contradictions, and power dynamics embedded within texts and discourses. Rather than taking language at face value, deconstruction seeks to reveal how meaning is constructed, how certain interpretations are privileged over others, and how these constructions can be destabilized or challenged. 1. Key concepts of deconstruction in discourse analysis. Binary oppositions. Understanding hierarchies in language. One of the central concepts in deconstruction is the idea of binary oppositions, such as good, evil, male, female, or speech, writing. Derrida argued that these oppositions are not neutral, they are hierarchical, with one term typically valued over the other. Deconstruction seeks to expose and disrupt these hierarchies by showing how the terms are interdependent and how the privileged term often depends on the marginalized one. Inversion and undermining. Deconstruction often involves inverting the binary to show that the marginalized term is just as essential, or even more so, than the privileged term. Interdependence. It demonstrates how these oppositions are not truly oppositional but rather mutually dependent for their meaning. Example. In the binary opposition of speech, writing, traditional Western philosophy often privileges speech as more direct and authentic, while writing is seen as secondary and derivative. Deconstruction reveals that writing is not merely a secondary form of communication but fundamentally shapes how we understand and use language, thus challenging the hierarchy that privileges speech. Différance. The play of differences in meaning. Derrida introduced the concept of différance, a play on the French words différer, to differ, and différer, to defer. Différance suggests that meaning is always deferred, never fully present or fixed, and that language is a system of differences without positive terms. In discourse analysis, this concept is used to explore how meaning is never stable and is always subject to change and reinterpretation. Meaning is process. Meaning is not a fixed property of words but is always in flux, created through the differences between words. Deferment of meaning. The meaning of a word is always deferred through an endless chain of signifiers, and it never arrives at a final, stable meaning. Example. The word freedom can have multiple interpretations depending on the context. In a political speech, freedom might be used to mean political liberty, economic opportunity, or even freedom from oppression. Deconstruction would explore how the meaning of freedom shifts depending on how it is used and how these different interpretations can coexist and contradict each other. Textuality and the concept of the text. Expanding what counts as a text. In deconstruction, the concept of the text is broadened to include not just written documents but any cultural artifact or system of signs that can be read or interpreted. This could include spoken language, images, rituals, or even social practices. Deconstruction examines how these texts are constructed, how they create meaning, and how they can be deconstructed to reveal hidden assumptions and power structures. Intertextuality. Deconstruction often looks at how texts are interrelated, how they reference or rely on other texts, and how meaning is constructed through these relationships. The infinite text. Since every text refers to other texts, there is no outside of the text, no final, objective meaning that can be reached. Example. Analyzing a political speech, a deconstructionist might not just focus on the words spoken but also consider the cultural and historical references, the visual elements of the speech, such as the setting and the speaker's attire, and how these elements interact to produce meaning. The speech is seen as part of a broader text that includes media coverage, public reactions, and historical analogies. Undecidability. Embracing ambiguity and contradiction. Deconstruction embraces undecidability, the idea that texts often contain conflicting interpretations or meanings that cannot be fully resolved. Instead of seeking to determine a single, correct interpretation, deconstruction reveals how texts generate multiple, often contradictory meanings. Resisting closure. Deconstruction resists the temptation to close off interpretation by settling on a single meaning, instead keeping open the possibility of multiple, conflicting readings. Productive contradictions. The contradictions and ambiguities within a text are not seen as flaws but as productive elements that reveal the complexity of meaning-making. Example. In legal discourse, a law might be interpreted in multiple ways depending on the context. A deconstructionist analysis would explore how different interpretations of the law conflict and how these conflicts reveal underlying tensions and power dynamics within the legal system. For instance, a law on freedom of speech might be interpreted as protecting hate speech under some circumstances while being used to restrict it under others, highlighting the undecidability of its application. Power and ideology. Revealing the political stakes in language. Deconstruction is deeply concerned with how language and texts reinforce or challenge power structures. By deconstructing a text, analysts can reveal how certain ideologies are embedded in language, how they privilege certain groups over others, and how they can be contested or subverted. Exposing ideology. Deconstruction reveals how texts perpetuate dominant ideologies, often by presenting them as natural or self-evident truths. Subversion of power. By deconstructing these texts, it is possible to challenge the assumptions that uphold power structures and to open up space for alternative perspectives. Example. A deconstructionist analysis of media coverage might explore how certain narratives, e.g., law and order, rhetoric, privilege state power and marginalize dissenting voices. By exposing the ideological underpinnings of this discourse, deconstruction can challenge the ways in which media reinforce dominant power structures. Point 2. Examples of deconstruction in discourse analysis. Example 1. Deconstructing national identity in political discourse. In political speeches, national identity is often constructed through binary oppositions, e.g., us, them, citizen, foreigner. A deconstructionist analysis would explore how these binaries are constructed, how they privilege certain identities over others, and how they can be disrupted. Binary opposition. A politician might contrast true patriots with those who question national values, privileging the former and marginalizing the latter. Deconstruction would show how this opposition is not natural but constructed and how it can be inverted or undermined. Intertextuality. The speech might draw on historical narratives, national symbols, and cultural references, all of which contribute to the construction of national identity. Deconstruction would explore how these elements interact and how they could be reinterpreted to challenge the dominant narrative. Example 2. Deconstructing gender in media representation. Media often relies on binary oppositions in its representation of gender, e.g., male, female, strong, weak. Deconstruction would analyze how these binaries are constructed and how they reinforce traditional gender roles. Difference. Deconstruction might explore how the meaning of masculinity and femininity shifts depending on the context, revealing that these categories are not fixed but fluid and interdependent. Undecidability. A deconstructionist analysis might highlight how a single character in a film embodies both traditionally masculine and feminine traits, creating ambiguity and challenging the binary opposition. Example 3. Deconstructing legal texts. Legal texts are often seen as authoritative and clear, but deconstruction reveals how they are open to multiple interpretations and how they can be used to reinforce or challenge power structures. Undecidability. A deconstructionist approach might analyze how a specific law can be interpreted in contradictory ways, depending on the context, revealing the inherent instability of legal language. Power and ideology. By deconstructing legal language, analysts can expose how certain interpretations of the law privilege powerful groups while marginalizing others, and how these interpretations can be contested. Example 4. Deconstructing historical narratives. Historical texts often present a linear, coherent narrative of events, but deconstruction can reveal the gaps, contradictions, and biases in these narratives. Textuality. A deconstructionist analysis might examine how a historical text relies on specific sources, omitting others, and how this shapes the narrative. Binary oppositions. The analysis might explore how the text constructs binary oppositions, such as civilized, savage, or progress, decline, and how these oppositions reinforce a particular interpretation of history. Conclusion. Deconstruction in discourse analysis is a powerful tool for uncovering the complexities, contradictions, and power dynamics embedded in language and texts. By challenging binary oppositions, embracing undecidability, and revealing the ideological stakes in discourse, deconstruction opens up new possibilities for understanding and interpreting language. Through examples like political speeches, media representations of gender, legal texts, and historical narratives, deconstruction shows how meaning is not fixed but is always open to reinterpretation, contestation, and change. Frequently asked questions. What is deconstruction in discourse analysis? Deconstruction, developed by Jacques Derrida, is a critical approach that examines how meaning is constructed within texts and discourses, focusing on the underlying assumptions, contradictions, and power dynamics. In discourse analysis, deconstruction seeks to uncover how certain interpretations are privileged over others and how these interpretations can be destabilized or challenged. What are binary oppositions, and why are they important in deconstruction? Binary oppositions are pairs of contrasting concepts like good, evil, male, female, or speech, writing. Derrida argued that these oppositions are hierarchical, with one term typically valued over the other. Deconstruction exposes and disrupts these hierarchies by showing that the terms are interdependent and that the privileged term often relies on the marginalized one for its meaning. How does the concept of difference relate to deconstruction? Difference is a key concept introduced by Derrida, suggesting that meaning is always deferred and never fully fixed. In deconstruction, this concept is used to explore how meaning is constantly in flux, created through the differences between words, and is always open to change and reinterpretation. What does deconstruction mean by textuality? In deconstruction, textuality refers to the idea that any cultural artifact or system of signs can be interpreted as a text. This broadens the scope of analysis beyond written documents to include spoken language, images, rituals, and social practices. Deconstruction examines how these texts create meaning and how they are interconnected, revealing hidden assumptions and power structures. What is undecidability in deconstruction? Undecidability refers to the idea that texts often contain conflicting interpretations or meanings that cannot be fully resolved. Deconstruction embraces these ambiguities and contradictions, resisting the temptation to settle on a single, definitive interpretation and instead highlighting the complexity of meaning-making. How does deconstruction address power and ideology in discourse? Deconstruction reveals how language and texts reinforce or challenge power structures by exposing the ideologies embedded in them. By deconstructing a text, analysts can uncover how certain groups or ideas are privileged over others and how these power dynamics can be contested or subverted. Can you provide an example of deconstruction in political discourse? In political discourse, deconstruction might examine how national identity is constructed through binary oppositions like us, them or citizen, foreigner. By analyzing these binaries, deconstruction can show how they privilege certain identities and marginalize others, challenging the naturalness of these distinctions and opening up space for alternative interpretations. How is deconstruction applied to media representations of gender? Deconstruction in media analysis might focus on how gender is represented through binary oppositions like male, female, or strong, weak. By exploring how these binaries are constructed and how the meanings of masculinity and femininity shift depending on the context, deconstruction challenges traditional gender roles and reveals the fluidity and interdependence of these categories. What is the significance of deconstruction in analyzing legal texts? Deconstruction reveals the inherent instability and ambiguity of legal language, showing how laws can be interpreted in multiple, often contradictory ways. This analysis can uncover how legal texts privilege certain interpretations that reinforce power structures, while also highlighting the potential for alternative readings that challenge these structures. How does deconstruction approach historical narratives? Deconstruction examines how historical narratives are constructed, focusing on the gaps, contradictions, and biases within them. By analyzing the binary oppositions and textual references that shape these narratives, deconstruction challenges the coherence and linearity of traditional historical accounts, revealing how they reinforce particular interpretations of history. Why is deconstruction considered a powerful tool in discourse analysis? Deconstruction is powerful because it uncovers the complexities, contradictions, and power dynamics embedded in language and texts. It challenges the idea that meaning is fixed and instead reveals how meaning is constantly open to reinterpretation and contestation. This approach provides deep insights into how language constructs social realities and maintains or challenges power structures. How does deconstruction relate to intertextuality? Deconstruction often involves examining the intertextual connections between texts, how one text references or relies on another to create meaning. This analysis reveals that no text exists in isolation and that meaning is constructed through a web of relationships between texts, making it impossible to arrive at a final, objective interpretation. What are the limitations of deconstruction in discourse analysis? While deconstruction offers valuable insights, it can also be criticized for its complexity and the difficulty of applying it in a systematic way. Its focus on undecidability and ambiguity may make it challenging to reach clear conclusions, and its emphasis on the instability of meaning can sometimes lead to a relativistic view that questions the possibility of any definitive interpretation.